What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars walks into a daytime talk show expecting a friendly conversation, only to be blindsided by a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than building him up? In just 30 seconds, a simple question turned into an accusation that would unravel an entire interview and expose the true colors of someone who forgot that respect goes both ways. This is the story of how Jamie Foxx, one of the most talented and beloved performers in entertainment, found himself in a position no guest should ever be in, facing off against Kelly Clarkson in what should have been a light-hearted promotional appearance, but instead became a masterclass in how not to treat your guests. The day started like any other taping of the Kelly Clarkson show. The audience was buzzing with excitement, the lights were bright, and the energy in the studio felt electric. Jamie walked onto the set with his signature charm, waving to the crowd, flashing that million-dollar smile that has made him a household name for decades. He was there to talk about his latest project, to share some laughs, and to connect with fans. Simple enough, right? Kelly greeted him with a hug that seemed warm enough on the surface, but there was something in her eyes, something that hinted at an agenda lurking beneath the surface. They sat down, the camera started rolling, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. They talked about his career, his family, the usual talk show fare that audiences have come to expect. But then, something shifted. Kelly leaned back in her chair, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and said, "So Jamie, I have to ask you something that I think everyone's been wondering about." The way she said it, with that tone that was trying to sound casual, but was loaded with something else entirely, should have been the first warning sign. Jamie, ever the professional, smiled and nodded. "Sure, ask me anything. There have been rumors, stories really, about you being difficult to work with on set. Some people have called you demanding, even diva-like. What do you say to that?" The audience went quiet. You could feel the temperature in the room drop. This wasn't a playful jab or a lighthearted tease. This was a direct attack, disguised as a question, thrown at a guest who came on the show in good faith. Jamie's smile faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. "Wow, okay. Well, I think anyone who's actually worked with me would tell you a different story. I'm passionate about my work, sure, but I respect everyone on set from the director to the crew members. I don't know where you're hearing these things, but they're not true." A reasonable response. A classy response. The kind of answer that should have allowed them to move forward. But Kelly wasn't done. "Really? Because I've heard from multiple sources that you've walked off sets, that you've made unreasonable demands, that you've even made some of your co-stars uncomfortable. Are you saying all of those people are lying?" The way she said it, with that condescending tone, like she was a prosecutor cross-examining a witness rather than a host talking to a guest, was shocking. Jamie sat up straighter, and you could see him processing what was happening. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an ambush. "Kelly, I don't know who your sources are, but yeah, I'm saying they're either lying or you're misunderstanding the situation. I've been in this industry for over 30 years. If I was the person you're describing, I wouldn't have the career I have. I wouldn't have the relationships I have with directors and actors who want to work with me again and again." His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it now. He was defending himself, and he had every right to. But Kelly, instead of backing down, instead of recognizing that she had crossed a line, doubled down. "So you're saying you've never had a disagreement on set? Never lost your temper? Never demanded special treatment?" Everyone has disagreements. That's part of collaboration. But there's a difference between having a professional conversation about creative choices and being difficult or demanding. You're painting me as some kind of monster, and I'm sitting here wondering why. Did I do something to you? Because this feels personal. And there it was, the question that needed to be asked. Because it did feel personal. It felt like Kelly had come into this interview with an axe to grind, with a predetermined narrative she wanted to push, regardless of what Jamie said or how he defended himself. Kelly laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was dismissive, almost mocking. "Oh, come on, Jamie. Don't be so sensitive. I'm just asking questions. If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe that says something about you." The audience was completely silent now. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others looked angry on Jamie's behalf, because what they were witnessing wasn't journalism. It wasn't even good television. It was a host using her platform to belittle a guest who couldn't fight back without looking bad. But Jamie wasn't going to just sit there and take it. Sensitive? Kelly, you just accused me of being a diva, of making people uncomfortable, of being difficult to work with, all based on anonymous sources that you won't name. And when I defend myself, you tell me I'm being sensitive? That's not pushback. That's disrespect. His voice was still controlled, but there was fire in it now. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't being aggressive, but he was standing his ground, and he had every right to. Kelly crossed her arms, and her expression shifted from fake sweetness to something colder. "You know what, Jamie? Maybe the reason people say these things about you is because you can't take criticism. You want everyone to worship you, to tell you how great you are. But the moment someone challenges you, you fall apart." The audience gasped. This wasn't just unprofessional anymore. This was cruel. Kelly had gone from asking pointed questions to launching personal attacks, and she was doing it with cameras rolling in front of a live studio audience. Jamie's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Kelly, let me ask you something. Have you ever actually worked with me? Have you ever been on a set with me? Have you ever seen me interact with crew members or directors or fellow actors?" Kelly waved her hand dismissively. "I don't need to work with you to see what's obvious. The stories speak for themselves." The stories. Right. Anonymous stories from unnamed sources that you're choosing to believe over my 30 years of work, over the testimony of people like Quentin Tarantino, who cast me in Django Unchained, over Cameron Diaz, who's worked with me multiple times, over every director who's called me back for another project. You're choosing gossip over facts. Kelly leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, so now you're name-dropping? Is that how you handle criticism? By listing your famous friends?" "I'm not name-dropping. I'm giving you examples of professional relationships that contradict your narrative. But you don't want to hear that, do you? You've already decided who I am before I even sat down in this chair." The tension in the studio was suffocating. Audience members were exchanging glances, some looking genuinely angry. One woman in the front row shook her head in disapproval, and Kelly saw it. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Doubt, maybe, or recognition that she had lost the room. But instead of backing down, she pushed harder. "You know what I think, Jamie? I think you're used to being in control. You're used to everyone saying yes to you, agreeing with you, making you feel special. And when someone like me comes along and asks the questions that others are afraid to ask, you can't handle it. You want to paint me as the bad guy, but really, I'm just doing my job." Jamie let out a long breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more powerful. "Your job? Kelly, your job as a host is to create a space where guests feel comfortable sharing their stories. Your job is to facilitate conversation, not to ambush people with accusations. Your job is to entertain your audience, sure, but not at the expense of your guests' dignity." Jamie stared at her for a long moment, and you could see the wheels turning in his head. He could have fired back. He could have listed his accomplishments, his awards, his decades of success. He could have reminded her that he was an Oscar winner, a Grammy winner, a box office star. But he didn't do any of that. Instead, he took a deep breath and said very quietly, "I don't need to sit here and be disrespected. I came on your show as a guest, as someone who thought we were going to have a good conversation. But you clearly had other plans. He started to stand up, and Kelly's eyes went wide. She clearly hadn't expected this. She had pushed and pushed, assuming that Jamie would just take it, that he would play along, that his professionalism would keep him in that chair no matter what she said. Wait, Jamie, come on. Don't be dramatic. Sit down. But Jamie was already unclipping his microphone. Dramatic? You spent the last 10 minutes attacking my character based on rumors and gossip, and I'm the one being dramatic? No, Kelly. I'm done. Kelly stood up too now, and her voice took on a desperate edge. You're really going to walk off my show? Do you know how that's going to look? Jamie turned to face her, and his expression was calm but firm. I know exactly how it's going to look. It's going to look like I have enough self-respect not to sit here while someone tears me down for entertainment. And honestly, I think that's going to look just fine. The audience started to applaud. Slowly at first, then louder, until the entire studio was clapping for Jamie as he walked toward the exit. Kelly stood there, frozen, clearly not knowing what to do. Her producers were scrambling, trying to figure out how to handle the situation, but there was no fixing this. The damage was done. As Jamie reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one more time. You know, Kelly, I've always admired your talent. I've rooted for you. But being talented doesn't give you the right to treat people badly. I hope you figure that out someday. And with that, he walked off the stage, leaving Kelly standing alone in front of an audience that was no longer on her side. The applause continued, and you could see Kelly's face flushing red, a mix of embarrassment and anger crossing her features. She tried to recover, turning to the audience with a forced smile. Well, that was unexpected. I guess some people really can't handle honest questions. But the audience wasn't buying it. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What Kelly had intended as a gotcha moment, a chance to take down a big star and create viral content, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of looking like a tough interviewer, she looked like a bully. Instead of Jamie looking weak, he looked dignified and strong. One audience member actually stood up and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That wasn't honest questions. That was just mean." Kelly's smile disappeared. She looked to her producers again, clearly wanting someone to cut to commercial, to end this nightmare. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every uncomfortable second. I think we need to take a break, Kelly finally said, her voice tight. The stage manager gave the signal, and the cameras finally stopped. But the damage was done. Everyone in that studio knew what they had witnessed. They had seen a host forget the basic rules of hospitality and respect. They had seen her push a guest too far, assume she could say anything without consequences, and then act shocked when that guest had the courage to walk away. Backstage, Jamie's team was waiting for him. They had watched the whole thing on the monitors, and they were furious on his behalf. But Jamie, ever the class act, just shook his head. It's fine. I said what I needed to say. Let's just go. As they headed toward the exit, several crew members stopped him, not to argue, not to try to convince him to come back, but to apologize. I'm so sorry, Jamie. That was completely out of line. You handled that with so much grace. We don't blame you for leaving. These were people who worked for Kelly, who depended on her show for their livelihoods, and even they couldn't defend what had just happened. That should have told Kelly everything she needed to know about how badly she had messed up. Back on stage, during the commercial break, Kelly was in crisis mode. Her producers were trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show, but Kelly wasn't listening. She was pacing back and forth, talking to herself, clearly replaying the confrontation in her head, and maybe, just maybe, starting to realize that she had gone too far. When the show came back from commercial, Kelly was alone on stage. No Jamie, no backup guest, just her and an audience that was still buzzing about what they had witnessed. So, that happened, Kelly said, trying to sound lighthearted, but failing miserably. I want to address what just occurred. I asked Jamie some tough questions because I believe in honest conversations. If he chose to leave rather than answer them, that's his choice. But even as she said it, you could hear the defensiveness in her voice. She wasn't taking responsibility. She wasn't acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, there was a difference between asking tough questions and launching personal attacks. She was doubling down, trying to spin the narrative in her favor. The audience wasn't responding the way she wanted. There was no applause, no supportive murmurs. Just silence. Uncomfortable, damning silence. Kelly tried to move on, introducing a pre-taped segment, but the energy never recovered. The rest of the show felt flat, lifeless. Everyone was still thinking about Jamie, about the confrontation, about the moment when a guest had to stand up for himself because the host had forgotten her role. Meanwhile, Jamie was already in his car, heading away from the studio. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't upset. He was just tired. Tired of having to defend himself against baseless accusations. Tired of being expected to smile and nod while someone disrespected him. Tired of the game. His phone was already blowing up with messages from friends, colleagues, and fans who had been in the audience or who worked on the show. Every single message was supportive. You did the right thing. That took guts. She was way out of line. Not one person, not a single person, thought Jamie had overreacted or been unprofessional. Because here's the thing about respect. It's not something you can demand. It's something you earn. And when you disrespect someone, especially someone who has earned their place through decades of hard work and talent, you can't be surprised when they refuse to play along. Jamie had built his career on being professional, on being kind to crews, on showing up and doing the work. He had stories, so many stories, of times he had gone out of his way to help young actors, to support struggling artists, to use his platform for good. He didn't need to prove anything to Kelly or to anyone else. His reputation spoke for itself. Kelly, on the other hand, had just shown the world a side of herself that many people probably suspected existed but had never seen so clearly. The entitled celebrity who thinks that having a platform means you can say whatever you want without consequences. The host who forgot that the guests are doing her a favor by appearing on her show, not the other way around. As Jamie's car pulled away from the studio, he looked out the window at the city passing by. He thought about all the interviews he had done over the years, all the hosts who had been kind and curious and respectful. This wasn't his first talk show, and it wouldn't be his last, but it would definitely be the most memorable. Not because of anything he had said or done to promote his project. Not because of any funny anecdote or heartwarming story, but because it was the day he reminded everyone watching that you don't have to accept disrespect, no matter how big the platform, no matter how bright the lights. Back at the studio, as the show wrapped up and the audience filed out, the conversations were all the same. Can you believe what she said to him? He had every right to leave. I felt so bad for him. She should apologize. Person after person, agreeing that they had witnessed something they shouldn't have, something that crossed a line. Kelly's team knew they had a problem. They had footage of one of the biggest stars in Hollywood walking off their show, and there was no way to spin it that made Kelly look good. They could edit the episode, cut out the worst parts, try to minimize the damage. But it wouldn't matter. The people who were there knew what happened. And in the age of social media, the truth always finds a way out. What Kelly didn't understand, what she failed to grasp in that moment, was that being a good host isn't about asking gotcha questions or creating dramatic moments. It's about making your guests feel comfortable enough to open up, to share their stories, to connect with the audience. It's about listening, about empathy, about recognizing that the people sitting across from you are human beings, not props for your show. Jamie understood that. He had hosted shows. He had been on countless panels. He had interviewed people himself. He knew how to make someone feel seen and heard. And that's why his response was so powerful. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He didn't stoop to Kelly's level. He simply stood up, stated his boundaries, and walked away. Dignity intact. As the sun set over the city, Jamie was already moving on with his day. He had other commitments, other projects, other people who valued and respected him. This interview would become a footnote in his long and successful career, a story he might tell someday about the time he had to walk off a show because the host forgot how to be decent. For Kelly, though, this was going to be a defining moment. Not the kind of defining moment she had hoped for when she planned those questions. Not a viral clip that showed her as a fearless interviewer, but a viral clip that showed her as someone who let power go to her head, who thought she could treat a guest badly without consequences. The lesson was simple, really. Respect is earned, but it can be lost in an instant. Kelly had spent years building her brand as America's sweetheart, the kind and talented girl next door who made it big. But in those few minutes, she had tarnished that image, possibly beyond repair. Jamie, on the other hand, had reinforced everything people loved about him. His talent, his grace, his ability to stand up for himself without being cruel or vindictive. He had shown the world that success and kindness can go hand in hand, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away. The confrontation was over, but the impact would last much longer. For everyone who watched, whether in the studio or later when clips inevitably surfaced, it was a reminder that how you treat people matters, that your platform doesn't give you the right to be cruel, that respect should be the baseline, not the exception. Jamie didn't need Kelly's show. He didn't need her approval or her platform. He had built his career on talent and hard work, and nothing she said could take that away from him. But Kelly needed her guests, needed their star power, needed their willingness to show up and make her show interesting. And she had just shown future guests exactly how she might treat them if the mood struck her. As Jamie finally arrived home, he took off his jacket and sat down for a moment. His phone was still buzzing with messages, but he ignored it for now. He thought about the interview, about the moment when he realized he had to leave, about the feeling of walking away from that toxic environment. He felt good, not happy about the confrontation, not pleased that it had happened, but satisfied that he had handled it the right way. He had stood up for himself, set a boundary, and done it all without losing his cool or his integrity. That was something to be proud of. Kelly, meanwhile, was likely having a very different evening, surrounded by producers and publicists, trying to do damage control, trying to figure out how to spin this, trying to protect her brand. But some things can't be spun. Some moments reveal truth, and no amount of PR magic can change what people saw with their own eyes. The audience members who were there would go home and tell their friends and family what happened. They would describe Kelly's tone, Jamie's composure, the tension in the room. They would talk about how uncomfortable it was, how they couldn't believe what they were hearing, how they were so glad Jamie stood up for himself. And those stories would spread, person to person, until everyone knew what really went down. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a moment that would be studied, discussed, analyzed. It would become part of talk show lore, an example of what not to do, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ego override empathy. Jamie had been in the entertainment industry long enough to know that these moments happen, that sometimes people forget themselves, forget their manners, forget that kindness costs nothing. He had probably even been prepared for the possibility that Kelly might ask some tough questions. But there's a difference between tough questions and personal attacks, between challenging someone and trying to humiliate them. Kelly had crossed that line, and she had done it confidently, almost gleefully, as if she expected Jamie to just take it, as if his professionalism meant he had no right to defend himself, as if being a guest on her show meant checking your dignity at the door. But Jamie had taught her, and everyone watching, an important lesson. You always have the right to walk away from disrespect. Always. No matter who's doing the disrespecting, no matter what stage you're on, no matter how many cameras are rolling, your self-respect is worth more than any interview, any publicity, any opportunity. As the night wore on and the reality of what had happened began to sink in, Kelly would have to make a choice. She could double down, insist she did nothing wrong, blame Jamie for being too sensitive. Or she could take a hard look at her behavior, acknowledge her mistakes, and do better in the future. Only time would tell which path she would choose. But one thing was certain. Jamie Foxx had walked off that stage with his head held high, his reputation intact, and his dignity firmly in place. And that, in the end, was what mattered most.